Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we've been covering for you today. In the cover of darkness, U.S. forces dealt a significant blow to the ISIS terrorist group, killing their leader. President Biden made the announcement earlier today.
Thanks to the bravery of our troops, this horrible terrorist leader is no more.
Virus cases are plunging throughout the country. We speak to physician and Congressman Greg Murphy to find out what this means for the role of the vaccine mandates moving forward. And the FDA has issued a warning saying that 2 Empowered Diagnostics COVID-19 tests are not FDA approved. Their test labels falsely indicate that they are authorized. The leader of ISIS is now dead. This is after U.S. Special Forces took him out in an operation. Troops tried their best to prevent killing innocent lives, but at least 3 innocent people died during this operation. NTD's Melina Wisecup has the details.
The successful operation in the Middle East comes at a time when President Biden's handling of foreign affairs is under the microscope. But now the president has a chance to redeem himself with a successful operation, counterterrorism operation that effectively killed the ISIS leader. And President Biden wasn't shy to quickly take credit for that. Here's his announcement from earlier today.
Last night, operating on my orders, the United States military forces successfully removed a major terrorist threat to the world, the global leader of ISIS.
He died as U.S. forces approached by exploding a bomb that killed himself and members of his family, the same death as the previous ISIS leader. No American lives were lost, but there was an issue with the helicopter early on in the operation. It was abandoned on site and had to be destroyed. The Pentagon reported that Abdullah was killed along with a small number of his followers, but no American lives were lost.
2 hours on site, and it speaks to the level of care that U.S. Special Operations Forces used in this mission.
At least 3 innocent people died during the operation, according to the Pentagon. But rescue workers reported that there were at least 13 people who died, among them women and children. The Pentagon is still investigating if those deaths were caused by American action.
The calculated efforts of our forces succeeded in protecting more than 10 women, children, and babies.
The decision to execute a raid instead of an airstrike put American forces at risk. But Biden said the troops handled the mission well.
And I directed the Department of Defense to take every precaution possible to minimize civilian casualties. Knowing that this terrorist had chosen to surround himself with families, including children.
This operation in the Middle East comes as 3,000 U.S. troops are now headed to Europe, a bid to show support to NATO allies as Russia tension looms. Today, troops from Russia and Belarus held joint combat training drills in Belarus, adding to the 100,000 troop buildup near Ukraine.
And on Russia, Melina, can you update us on where we are on that? We know there's been a bipartisan effort in Congress to sanction Russia. Can we expect to see that anytime soon? And has any progress been made?
Well, Steve, we know these sanctions have been an area of focus for lawmakers all week, and senators are still working on that bipartisan bill to sanction Russia. They're just having to deal with some small minor differences and also getting members of their own parties in line so that they can gather enough support to make sure it passes through the Senate. But at the same time that senators are working on this, the House is also working on almost an identical version of this bill. So once all members are in line and there's enough support garnered to pass it, this sanctions bill should move pretty quickly through both chambers of Congress. But the Senate is wrapping up for the week, so it will be at least until next week before we can see any movement on these Russia sanctions. Steve, back to you.
Thanks for that, Melina. And President Biden on Thursday emphasized unity at a national prayer breakfast with members of Congress, the first in-person prayer breakfast in 2 years due to the pandemic. Biden said although there are divisions, most Americans have common values and a faith in the United States of America. And Congressman Greg Murphy is a transplant surgeon and a practicing physician. We sat down with Congressman Murphy to get a sense of what we may have learned now that we're 2 years into the pandemic. Here's a look. Congressman Greg Murphy, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you, Steve.
Now, Congressman, Johns Hopkins University just recently released a report that said that the lockdowns virtually did nothing to reduce deaths and fatality during the height of the pandemic. What would you say some of the biggest things that we've learned from the lockdown?
Yes, Steve, I actually read that story. It's about 60, I read that paper. It's about 60 pages long, a meta-analysis looking at a lot of different papers and trying to cull results. I think and I've said this many, many times, we've been building a plane while flying it with this novel virus. However, I think we learned a lot of what we needed to learn over a year ago, and so many of the policies that are occurring now, still today, are antiquated and have no relation to science. And the sad thing is, I think the political science has truly taken over the medical science. We're shaming people for not wearing masks, or we're trying to bully people into getting vaccines. We're closing businesses down, which lead to unemployment, depression, substance abuse, those kind of things. Yes, we did need to shut things down originally. I agree with that 100% and still do. But sadly enough, there have been repercussions. And we look back, this particular study points out that says, really, if you look at all the lives that were truly saved, all the interventions that did, really was only about 0.2% of those individuals that really benefited from that. But Steve, if you look on the other hand of the thing, and this is where I wrote an NIH letter to ask this to be studied, years of life lost. What have we done to the other populations because of the lockdowns? And we've seen now that 9 million cancer screenings did not occur because of lockdowns. We know for a fact that thousands of people during the lockdowns who were told to stay home, stayed home with chest pain and then subsequently had heart attacks and died at home. So we know a lot more people have died in relation to what our actions were during the pandemic than maybe perhaps even the pandemic itself.
Now, Congressman, what do we know in the way of how the pandemic has affected mental health on both adults and children?
Yeah, it's been tragic. It's been tragic on so many different fronts. And we'll just take children, for example. Screen time during this entire pandemic skyrocketed. We're screaming at the kids beforehand to get off the screen, and then now we were screaming at them to get on the screen. We locked them away from schools. We kept them away from friends, from family. The socialization that should occur with young children, where they were isolated. And so it's really taken away not only years of education, but years of socialization. And so many of the other things, keeping people away from their churches, keeping people away from their friends and family, you have seen subsequent results from that. We've seen now, in addition to our porous southern border, first time ever in the nation's history, 100,000 people died from overdose deaths. That is a tragedy on our nation. That's a direct result not only of the lockdowns, which lead to depression, which leads to subsequent substance abuse, but also the porous border. So we look at also now the spike in suicides, especially among younger females. We've seen a spike in home domestic abuse. So many of these individuals really, because of being locked down, frustration, anger, and all those things and how they release that, have led to a great number of societal ills.
Now, Congressman, we're still seeing some of the remnants of these lockdowns here in D.C. with mask mandates to get into a business, vaccine requirements to eat at restaurants. The financial toll that the pandemic has taken and from these lockdowns and the measures is incalculable. What role do you see these mandates playing as we start to see cases declining?
Well, I don't think the mandates really should have ever been incepted to begin with, to be very honest with you. Had dinner with a friend 2 nights ago in a restaurant that had subsequently closed and then reopened. Been there for 40 years, but it had to close because of the lockdowns. You walk in now and you need your vaccine card to prove in a restaurant that you can eat there, plus your photo ID, which is very coincidental that you don't need one of those to vote, but you need one of them to get a cheeseburger. I think sadly enough, it's become entirely political. It's not relating to science, and some of the thought leaders supposedly at this nation's front history, I'll speak to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky specifically, I think have gotten way off of the medical science, the objective science, and turned to one of personal arrogance, and they've misled the American people and led to a lot of mistrust in medicine.
Now, as I just mentioned, we're seeing cases starting to plunge. What role do you think, or do you think that vaccinating children and babies is necessary as we start to see it?
Steve, that's a hot button issue with me. I believe we have vaccinations to treat people who are at risk to get lesser disease, less severe disease, and prevent mortality. If you look at the population, the underage 18 population, and how this particular virus has affected them, it has been, by and large, non-existent with these kids. Yes, sadly enough, we have had some children that have died from COVID, but we have children that die every year from meningitis and other infectious diseases. But I am very, very, very reluctant to recommend to parents under age 18 that their child be vaccinated. We do know that in men under age 35 who have gotten vaccinated, there's about a 2 out of 10,000 chance of getting about a 2% chance of actually getting myocarditis. And of those, 2% actually will have long-term effects from this myocarditis. So this vaccine, while it's good for people who really need it, should not be, in my opinion, blanketed across our nation, especially in our pediatric population.
Congressman and physician Greg Murphy, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Have a great day.
A Food and Drug Administration document explaining the agency's approval of MODERNA's COVID-19 vaccine was removed from the agency's website overnight. This is after the Epoch Times sent the agency questions about heart inflammation rates it reported. The removed report details how regulators approved Moderna's vaccine and also cited that among males aged 18 to 25, the rate of myocarditis following Moderna's shots was 148 to every 1 million males that have been vaccinated. That rate is more than 2 times higher than other CDC estimates. An FDA spokesperson told the Epoch Times that they're aware of the issue and hope to have the document reposted soon. And the FDA issued a warning about 2 COVID-19 tests made by Empowered Diagnostics. The labeling on the test indicate that they're approved by the FDA, when in fact they're not. Empowered Diagnostics makes the Clear COVID-19 rapid antigen tests. The FDA says that individuals should not use their tests due to the potentially higher risk of false results when using unauthorized tests. According to the FDA, both tests have been recalled by Empowered Diagnostics. Border Patrol agents last year apprehended more than 1.3 million illegal immigrants crossing into Texas, while hundreds of thousands more were not captured. Republican lawmakers are calling attention to this crisis on our southern border.
One of the things that we've been disappointed in, those of us who are concerned about homeland security or national security, is how much or how little the crisis at the border has been covered, how much it's been ignored.
The Border Patrol reports a 10 times increase in fentanyl seized in South Texas last year. Texas Senator John Cornyn told NTD the criminal organizations are making billions of dollars by exploiting the U.S. border.
Organizations have learned if they flood the zone, if they overwhelm the capacity of Border Patrol, then Border Patrol is going to be taking care of unaccompanied children and processing these migrants under the law, but at the same time leaving their duty station and allowing drugs to flood into the country. So this is part of a business model, a business plan by these criminal organizations.
Cornyn and Democratic Senator Sinema are pushing a bipartisan bill, but the White House hasn't shown any interest as of yet. President Biden visited New York City today, and there Biden announced his administration's strategy for confronting the national surge in gun violence. Just one day before the Beijing Olympics, a U.S. congressman stood outside the Capitol along with those persecuted by the communist regime. They called out China and those complicit in the United States. And Victims of Communism CEO and former ambassador Andrew Bremberg tells us that his organization has just released a report on U.S. companies complicit in assisting the CCP with their ongoing crimes against humanity. We'll bring you those details. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capitol Report. President Biden visited New York City today, and there he announced his administration's strategy to address surging gun violence. The visit to the nation's largest police headquarters comes amid a rash of shootings in major cities.
Enough is enough because we know we can do things about this. It's time to fund communities, community police, and the people who are going to protect them.
President Biden said every day in this country, hundreds are shot, with over 100 killed on a daily basis. Biden asked Congress for more funding for the Justice Department to stop selling or transferring guns used in violent crimes.
Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers on Thursday rallied outside the U.S. Capitol. They decry the Beijing Olympics, citing a long list of human rights abuses by the Chinese Communist Party. The Games are slated to begin in just one day.
This is the equivalent of the 1936 Nazi Olympics in Berlin.
Congressman Chris Smith attended the protest. He warns that Beijing will act with more impunity if its propaganda through the Olympics succeeds.
And now we have it in 2022 with an ongoing massive destruction, genocide against the Uyghurs, and everyone else is subjected to just horrible mistreatment, including torture and death. The Falun Gong, for example, are having their organs taken.
Chinese leader Xi Jinping on the same day promised a, quote, safe and splendid Olympics. But Wang Dan, a Chinese dissident and survivor of the Tiananmen Square massacre, says any promise by the CCP is not to be believed.
Traditionally, CCP is a big liar. We all know the history, so any word come out from their mouths, I will not believe it.
An activist from Hong Kong says the same. He's seen China crush the freedoms of the Hong Kongers.
So I think you're going to see the repeated pattern of China breaking its promises and only try to serve its own interests when it's needed.
Also in the spotlight are the American companies they say contribute to China's surveillance, military, and human rights abuses. This report right here, put together by the rally organizer, has a scorecard for 8 of them, including Apple, Facebook, and Intel, which is the sponsor of the Beijing Olympics.
So at some point, corporate America needs to pivot and said, mea culpa, we made a mistake. We're enabling cruelty that is just like the Nazis.
New data analysis shows that corporate sponsors of the Beijing Olympics spent more than $30 million lobbying Washington in 2021. Iris Tao, NTD News.
And on the eve before the Olympics begin, we had a chance to speak with President and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Fund, Ambassador Andrew Bremberg. Here's a look. Ambassador Bremberg, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, Ambassador, we're on the eve of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. You just had a big event out in the pouring rain. Do you think that China represents the Olympic spirit?
Absolutely not. And the event that we just held right in front of the U.S. Capitol, I think was really important. We at Victims of Communism Foundation, co-sponsoring with a number of other human rights active organizations, held an important rally to speak loudly the truth. There should be no Beijing 2022 Olympics, even though they're about to begin tomorrow. And they really called on leaders in the United States, our government, our business leaders, and leaders in the international community to stand up and speak the truth about what's happening in China right now.
What type of message do you think it sends when we see the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, rewarding Beijing with an Olympics?
It shows that the type of engagement we've tried to do with, the Chinese Communist Party, which is clearly now under Xi Jinping a very totalitarian regime. There's no more kind of illusion of a reform, going on. That the way we interact with them of not strong organizations or powers like the IOC, like companies, like many international organizations, we think that by interacting we're going to bring those kind of Western values and that's going to help take root in China. What happens is, no, the CCP's approach infects those organizations. So that's what we see now with the IOC, and we see, unfortunately, in the UN system, where the Secretary General of the United Nations is going to Beijing to be used as a tool or a puppet in the propaganda efforts. The UN High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, is sitting and blocking her own office from releasing a report on their evidence collected of what's happening in terms of the genocide in Xinjiang with Uyghurs. She's blocking this report that's been ready now for, by all accounts, more than a year, again, to not interfere with the propaganda effort that the CCP is going to try to engage in during these Olympic Games.
Now, I want to ask you about major American corporations. Many of them have been very proactive in calling for social justice change. We've seen that with the BLM movement. The evidence is clear. As you mentioned, China is guilty of at least 1, 2, or possibly 3 genocides. And yet, when it comes to these issues, these big corporations are virtually silent. Why is that?
I think you've touched on one of the most kind of scandalous aspects of what's happening in the United States today, particularly vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party, is this total either apathy or greed or just willingness to turn a blind eye by many, not all, but many in the U.S. corporate elite, and looking to continue to engage deeply with some of the most troubling practices by the Chinese Communist Party. Today, our organization released a new report. It is the Corporate Complicity Scorecard that we look at and examine 8 major U.S. corporations and look at how they have engaged in different corporate activities inside China. Now, the report doesn't assume that just doing any business in China is bad. What we targeted and looked at, because unfortunately many companies don't want to make it very easy to find or very transparent of what activities they're engaged in. But what the report focuses on are activities that are directly or indirectly linked to the genocide or forced labor practices happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, participation in the ever-growing surveillance state that the Chinese Communist Party is pursuing, that will, has the risk of not only causing huge human rights violations in China, but being spread around the world. And then the third element was the focus on its engagement with any of the kind of advanced militarization happening by working with the PLA. Because unfortunately, we've seen a lot in the news that there'll be coverage of one individual company, as engaged in a certain way in China, and we don't have no context for understanding, like, well, how pervasive is that? Is that really a big deal or not? So what we've tried to do is lay out this very kind of objective, transparent framework that we can look at and now grade companies, and hopefully more in the future, on how their activities, how complicit they are by their actions in some of the kind of most clearly worst activities by the Chinese Communist Party.
Ambassador Bremberg, thank you.
Thank you.
With the Beijing Winter Olympics nearly upon us, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi joined witnesses to shed light on the egregious human rights abuses taking place in China.
The People's Republic of China is perpetrating a campaign of gross human rights violations, including genocide.
During a congressional hearing, Pelosi listed the horrific human rights abuses taking place at the hands of the Chinese Communist regime.
Yet the Chinese government works desperately to cover up their abuses, rewriting history and projecting a very different image to the world.
Pelosi said for years many in Congress have fought to hold Beijing accountable, including to deny them the honor of hosting the Olympics. But now the IOC, aided by corporate sponsors, has turned a blind eye yet again with the 2022 Winter Olympics, bolstering their bottom lines.
If we do not speak out against human rights violations in China because of commercial interest, we lose all moral authority to speak out against human rights violations anywhere.
Pelosi also reminded the athletes not to trust the CCP's propaganda. U.S.-born pandas should not be sent to China. That's according to an amendment introduced by North Carolina Congresswoman Nancy MACE. Pandas are loaned to the United States at a cost of $500,000 each, but according to the agreement, they must be returned to China along with their offspring. The Republican lawmaker says that the Chinese regime loans giant pandas to zoos around the world to soften the image of the CCP. She says the United States should say no to propaganda of an oppressive regime that is responsible for the, quote, COVID-19 fiasco from the Wuhan lab and the ongoing genocide against the Uyghurs.